Right.
But then you can take it in so many different directions. And, you do see a lot of the vampires that are very romanticized, and they're almost, protective of humans or whatever. They're sort of angelic almost. And I wanted to go in a direction where vampires were more predatory.
Right.
They are monsters, but at the same time, they're still able to struggle with issues relating to humanity and things like that. So.
Right, because they were humans at once, and you leave just enough.
Exactly, yeah, and they didn't necessarily have a choice about whether they became monsters.
Right, and there's that internal struggle, with some of the vampires. The main character, she still has some humanity in there, and it veers its head at the most inconvenient times sometimes. She's very interesting. She's a very interesting character. And
well, it's an interesting situation when you have someone who's a former church kid who's murdered and wakes up not only with a thirst for blood, but not having a soul and not having a connection to the spiritual side of her life that she sort of took for granted as a human.
Right.
So, yeah, that's been so much fun to play with.
Yeah, and you have set it in Newfoundland, and the settings are very well done and very realistic. So you're really transported. Like when you're reading this, you really feel like you could picture that. She's in this locale because you know what the landscape of the province is like, and it gets foggy and dreary and dark, and so and rocky and dangerous, and so it's a perfect place for vampires if you think about it.
It really is, and I've always sort of thought that I don't know what it is about this island, but there's just something like it's very rugged, but it's still beautiful, and there's something kind of magical about it, especially when you do get that fog and everything coming in. So, yeah, I always plan to set something fantasy-based here.
Yeah, no, and it's and I mean, if you think again, go back to the Twilight series, it's set on the west coast of the U.S. and it's near, Washington State, I think it is, and very wet, dreary weather where it's always raining on the west coast. It's very similar weather to Vancouver, maybe, maybe more rainy than that, and so that's why they did that, so that they could have them outside without sunshine a lot. And so that works in Newfoundland as well. I always think that they could be in Newfoundland because, especially on the Avalon. Not so much in Lewisport. The vampires could never come out. It's very sunny a lot of days of the year.
It is, yeah. I mean, mine tend to generally only come out at night anyway, but they do vastly prefer, cloudy or foggy weather.
Yeah. It just feels, it's that sense of, the drama of vampires and the monster thing. You need the dark and the spookiness.
It sets the tone that you want, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're an independent author.
Yes.
And that is very common these days. I read probably 75% independent now and 25% traditional. And so what made you decide to go that way? Was it a decision, or did you always know was the
No, I didn't always know, because, I mean, for a long time, it didn't really seem like an option, right?
Right.
I think when I was starting out writing, there was still sort of just the assumption that, okay, well, if you want to have a good book and you want, professional grade book, and you want to have, have it edited and something that you can pass down to your grandchildren and be proud of, you're going to have to find an agent, and you're going to be going through a publisher.
Right.
And so that was how I approached it. I mean, when I was writing the book, I was thinking, okay, well, if I ever want to hold this in my hand as a physical book, then that's the way I'm going to have to go. Sorry, I'm just going to take a quick drink here. My mouth is getting all dried out. And then I was even at the point where I was researching agents and had to query a book and everything like that. And I'm trying to think how it happened. Reading blogs, people who were going the independent route, and listening to a podcast where they were, what did they have on there? I think they had a traditionally published author, an independently published author, a freelance editor, and somebody else. The fourth guest might have rotated. And I was listening to this podcast, and they would be talking about all this stuff, and I slowly started to realize that there were other options. And I think what it came down to for me was the fact that I'm a bit of a control freak.
Right.
I heard a few horror stories about people who were traditionally published and didn't get the level of editing they expected, or got terrible book covers, or just didn't get the publishing support that they wanted. And I didn't really want to give up full control of my stories. So what I realized is that there was a middle ground, and I had the option of hiring a very, very good professional editor who would dive deep into the story and give it the kind of developmental and content edits as well as line editing that I would have got from a traditional publisher. And, of course, I paid for that. I paid quite a bit for it. But, I mean, it was worth every penny because every book that he did for me was an education. Right. And, I learned so much from that process.
A good editor will make your writing better, and I don't just mean by the editing. When you get your edits back, when you send your book for editing, and you get the response back, and you get the suggested changes, and I mean aside from proofreading type things, they will pick those up. When you get those suggestions over time, you will learn things from that editor that you will then apply to the next book. Whereas the next time, those errors, if they're there by accident because you know better. And now I have where when I send a manuscript to an editor now, I will tell them, I know I do this, watch for it, and I know I do that. And if you see an incident of this, please keep an eye open for it. Because,
please let me know.
Because and I've learned that from editors, not from other writers, but from the feedback that I've gotten from editors. And I actually stopped. I used to do all this where I would send, my work to feedback groups and critique groups, and
which are also valuable.
They're very valuable, but I never got anything of valuable compared to what I got from an actual real good editor.
No,
definitely did not learn things the same. Maybe because most of that was samples of writing, not just the entire thing. And an editor,
it could be,
they will look at the entire book, right? They're looking at a passage in context, which is completely different. They're able to say, well, chapter 3 is totally different pacing, and it's not a bit like all the rest of the chapters in the book, and you've completely veered, and maybe you should look at, did you do that on purpose? And I wanted chapter 3 to be really fast, so I changed the pacing deliberately, or whatever. There can be deliberate things, but at least they point those things out to you, or no, I didn't mean to do that, so let me just look and try to make it more like the rest of the book. So
for sure, and even, they might spot a problem and suggest a solution. You might not want to use their solution, but if you're aware of the problem, then you can come up with your own solution and approach it, in your own way, and that's valuable too.
I find that's what happens with me. I'll get a suggestion. Well, maybe you could change this to this, and I'll look at it and I'll go, no, that doesn't work, because that's not how I wanted it to be. But if I do that, it still does the same thing. Like if I go back to chapter 1 now and I insert a little, okay, now you have another, because sometimes with me it's, I will write something in the book that is maybe giving the reader a clue, right? I was telling them a little bit about it, a couple of lines that's saying this character believes this or does this or did that.
Yes.
But it's not precise or it's not vague. And then, so then they have that little thing. And then later on they will do something and their motivation will be this little piece. And they'll say, all you've said, you haven't really given us any motivation. That's a new word.
It's a good word. I like it.
It's a good word. You haven't given us enough motivation. Is that really a character thing, or is that just... So then I will go back maybe through the book and create a couple of incidents where I had a character that was too good to have done what he did at the end. Do you know what I mean? He was a good guy, and all of a sudden at the end, this terrible thing he did. And there was no reason for it. And so I went back and put in several little sort of incidents where he either was called on being that way, or like another character saying, you always do this, or you know what I mean? And so then when you got to that piece, it made a lot more sense. And that
the setup is so important, right?
Right. And the editor did not make that suggestion. But the editor did say, I don't know why this guy did this. And she'd read the entire book, so she knew, I don't know why this guy did this. And I'm like, well, I know, but okay, so if you don't, as the reader, I need to let you know. So, I fix that up going through. And so that's what I've learned from editors. And reading samples and getting feedback from critique has been better for actual construction of paragraphs and chapters and like construction stuff. But at story stuff, I find the editor has helped a lot with cohesiveness and things just making sense.
Yeah,
so,
and I think too, even if you take a whole story to a critique group, often as authors, we're very aware of the fact that we're going to be getting feedback from these people too, so we try to be gentle and we choose our words carefully, and we say, well, this is just how I feel about this. This is my personal reaction, or at least that's kind of how I tend to do things, because I recognize I'm not a professional editor. If I have a professional editor and I am paying him or her very good money to rip my story apart, they're not going to be scared to take their gloves off and say, why the heck did you do this? Or this is completely out of character for this person. And, they're not going to hold back because I am paying them to make my story the best it can possibly be.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like going to the hairdressers. It's like, I need to get some color in my hair, but I don't want to look ugly while the foils are in. You don't get the color without the ugly foils, right?
For sure, yeah.
So, and we're sensitive over our work. It's our work that we've spent hours and hours, and we think, this is good. I've let go of a lot of that, and I don't know if you are, but I've let go because I want my stuff to look as good as possible. So I want editors to be brutal, in a sense, like to just tell me.
This is the thing. Like, I mean, I have got edits back, and I have cried over them because, I thought the story was where I wanted it to be, and then all of a sudden I look at it again and I go, oh, I did mess that up, or this could be so much better if I rewrote half the book, and I'll be in tears over it. But the whole point of having an editor is so that I get through that before I publish, and I don't have readers coming to me after and making the same criticisms when the book is already published and it's done and I can't fix it. And I try to keep that in mind, but I am still fairly thin-skinned about it.
A while back, I had someone send me a piece of writing that, you get this writing, and there was a spark of brilliance in it, but a spark of the story was very compelling, but the writing was it did this point of view where it was first person, third person, first person, third person, like back and forth all the time with no explanation.
Oh,
and it made no sense. Now this was someone who wasn't an experienced writer, and so I tried to buffer things a little bit, and I said, there's as I just said, a spark of brilliance in this. Like the story is so compelling, but the way you've switched point of view back and forth is very. And she said, well, that's her being introspective. So the first person is like, but 5 times in 2 sentences is too much, right? And with no
it pulls you out of it as a reader, right?
Right. It was like I couldn't read a book with this, and I don't think anybody else could. And so I pointed that out, and she just completely sent me an email, just completely, totally put up walls, and I just didn't understand her vision, and I'm thinking, if your vision is to confuse the reader.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, you can offer your opinion, and you can try to be helpful, but whether somebody takes that advice or decides not to, I mean, that's their book, and you did what you could, right?
It came to the point that I think she actually didn't get point of view. Like she didn't understand first and third and omniscient, and she just didn't get the point of view, and that's a part of writing. So I think she didn't even realize she was doing it. And when I pointed it out, I'm like, I didn't do that. And I'm like, here's an example. Like, this is first, this is third. And she just lost it. And I was like, I'm glad I'm not like that. And even if I get my back up a little bit. I don't
Yeah.
take